You're sitting there wondering what they're feeling while all you feel is the silence. And silence can be deafening, can't it? Because in that quiet, your mind starts to tell stories. They don't care. They've moved on. It meant nothing. But here's the truth you need to hold on to. Just because someone is silent doesn't mean they are unaffected. In fact, for someone who is emotionally avoidant, silence is often the only way they know how to cope with feelings that are too big for them to understand. You see, when you walked away or when no contact began, you didn't just remove your presence. You removed their escape. Because when you were there, they could distract themselves. They could keep things surface level. They could avoid going deeper. But now there's space. And space is dangerous for someone who has spent their life running from emotion. Because in that space, thoughts echo. They start to wonder why they feel unsettled. Why something feels missing. Why the peace they thought they'd have doesn't feel as peaceful as they imagined. At first, they may feel relief. Relief from pressure, relief from expectations, relief from emotional intensity. But here's what no one tells you. Relief is temporary when it's built on avoidance. Because what they avoided didn't disappear. It just went quiet. And in that quiet, something powerful begins to happen. They start to feel your absence in moments they didn't expect. A song, a place, a random memory that slips in when they least want it to. And here's the irony. They may miss you most when they finally have the freedom they thought they wanted. Because what they had with you wasn't just a relationship. It was safety. It was presence. It was someone who stayed when things got hard. And people who struggle with emotional closeness often don't recognize the value of that until it's no longer available to them. But listen carefully. This is where your power lies. No contact is not a strategy to make them miss you. It's not a game to trigger their emotions. It's a return to yourself, because while they are out there, slowly confronting feelings they once buried, you are here with an opportunity to transform, to rebuild your sense of worth, to reconnect with your identity, to remind yourself that your value was never dependent on their ability to see it. And that's the shift, because the moment you stop asking, what are they feeling, and start asking, who am I becoming through this? You take your power back, and something remarkable happens when you do that. You become someone they can no longer recognize in the old way, not because you've changed for them, but because you've returned to yourself. And when that happens, whether they come back or not becomes secondary, because you're no longer waiting to be chosen. You've already chosen yourself. And that is the one thing no distance, no silence, and no avoidance can ever take away from you. Silence, especially from someone who once shared a connection with you, can feel like a cold, definitive answer. It's easy to interpret it as indifference, as if their lack of words is proof that they have emotionally checked out. But that interpretation, while understandable, is often far from the truth, especially when you're dealing with someone who leans toward dismissive avoidance. For this kind of person, silence is not always a statement of how little they feel. More often, it's a reflection of how much they feel and how unequipped they are to handle it. You have to understand that not everyone processes emotions in a direct, expressive way. Some people were conditioned over years to believe that emotions are unsafe, overwhelming, or even unnecessary. So when something stirs deep feelings inside them, like intimacy, vulnerability, or the fear of losing someone, they don't lean in. They pull away. Silence becomes their shield. When emotions rise to a level they can't easily categorize or control, their instinct isn't to talk it through or seek reassurance. It's to create distance, not because the connection didn't matter, but because it mattered in a way that felt destabilizing. And instead of learning how to sit with that discomfort, they learned how to escape it. So when you experience their silence, what you're often witnessing is not emotional emptiness. It's emotional overload that has no healthy outlet. Imagine feeling something strongly, but not having the language, the tools, or even the permission within yourself to express it. That creates internal pressure. And rather than risk saying the wrong thing, being misunderstood, or exposing vulnerability, they choose the one thing that feels safest, saying nothing at all. To you, that silence feels like rejection. To them, it feels like control. It's the one place where they can avoid the unpredictability of emotional exchange. Because conversations require presence, honesty, and sometimes accountability. And those are precisely the areas where they feel most exposed. There's also another layer to this silence. When they go quiet, they're not just avoiding you, they're avoiding what being around you brings up in them. You may represent closeness, emotional depth, or expectations they're not ready to meet, so stepping back into silence becomes a way to quiet those internal triggers. But here's the paradox: avoiding emotions doesn't eliminate them, it only postpones them. While they may appear unaffected on the outside, internally there can be a slow build-up of thoughts they haven't processed. Moments where they think about what happened, what they felt, what they didn't say. It just doesn't come out in real time the way it might with someone more emotionally open. This is why silence from an avoidant person can be so confusing. There's a disconnect between what they feel and what they show. You're looking for visible signs, words, actions, reassurance, but their internal world doesn't translate that way. And that can leave you filling in the blanks with your worst fears. But their silence is not always the absence of care. Sometimes it's the presence of emotions they don't yet know how to face. They may replay conversations in their head without ever reaching out. They may feel a sense of loss but struggle to label it. They may even miss you, but not know how to bridge the gap between feeling and action, because for them, action requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like risk. So they stay silent, not because nothing is happening inside them, but because too much is happening. And silence is the only way they know how to keep it contained. When no contact begins, it creates a shift in the dynamic that a dismissive avoidant person doesn't always expect. In the relationship, whether they realized it or not, there was a certain level of control they maintained. Control over how close things got, when conversations happened, how much vulnerability was allowed, and even when they could pull away and come back. That sense of control gave them emotional safety. It allowed them to engage in the relationship without feeling completely exposed. But no contact disrupts that structure entirely. Suddenly, the patterns they relied on no longer exist. There's no message to respond to later, no familiar presence they can step in and out of, no emotional access point that they can manage on their own terms. And for someone who is used to controlling distance, that loss of control can feel deeply unsettling, even if they don't consciously recognize it. At first, they might not react in an obvious way. In fact, they may double down on their independence. They may tell themselves they prefer the space, that this is better, that they don't need the connection. But underneath that surface, something subtle begins to shift. Because control isn't just about distance, it's also about predictability. And no contact removes predictability. They no longer know what you're thinking. They don't know how you're feeling. They don't know if you're moving on, healing, or forgetting them entirely. That uncertainty creates a quiet tension. For someone who avoided emotional depth, this can be one of the first times they're left alone with unanswered questions. And questions have a way of pulling attention back to the very thing they were trying to avoid. They might start to wonder why you haven't reached out. They may notice the absence in moments where they once expected your presence. They may even feel a subtle shift in their sense of identity, because whether they admit it or not, you were part of their emotional landscape. This is where curiosity begins to form. Not always in a dramatic or immediate way, but slowly, almost quietly. It might show up as a passing thought. What are they doing right now? Or have they already moved on? At first, these thoughts are easy to dismiss, but over time, if there is no new information to replace them, they tend to return. And each time they return, they carry a little more weight. Because human nature resists unresolved situations. When something ends without clarity, or when access is suddenly removed, the mind tries to fill the gap. It starts to reconstruct memories, re-examine interactions, and search for meaning. For an avoidant person, T, his process is unfamiliar territory. They are not used to sitting with emotional ambiguity. They're used to creating distance to avoid exactly this kind of introspection. But now, the distance isn't something they control. It's something imposed by your absence. And that's what makes it powerful. It's not about making them chase you or creating a reaction. It's about removing the framework that allowed them to stay comfortable in avoidance. Without that framework, they are left to face a reality they didn't design. And that reality includes the possibility that they may have lost something meaningful. Even if they don't fully process it right away, even if they resist it, even if they distract themselves, there's a part of them that begins to recognize that something has changed and not on their terms. That's where reflection begins. Not always consciously, not always in a way that leads to immediate action, but in small, quiet moments where the absence becomes noticeable, where the lack of control becomes real, and where curiosity starts to replace certainty. And curiosity, over time, has a way of opening doors that avoidance once kept firmly closed. At the beginning of no contact, there is often something that looks like peace on their end, a kind of lightness, a sense that the pressure has lifted. And if you were to observe them from the outside, you might even believe they're doing perfectly fine, maybe even better than before. But what you're seeing in that moment isn't emotional resolution. It's emotional relief, and relief, especially for someone who leans toward avoidance, can be very deceptive. Because what they feel isn't the absence of care, it's the absence of immediate emotional demand. Think about what the relationship represented for them. It likely came with expectations, communication, consistency, vulnerability, accountability. Even if those expectations were healthy and reasonable, for someone who struggles with emotional closeness, they can feel heavy over time. Not because they don't value the connection, but because they don't yet know how to show up fully within it. So when no contact begins, that weight seems to disappear. There's no one asking how they feel, no one seeking clarity, no one inviting them into deeper emotional territory. And for a moment that feels freeing. They can breathe again. They can return to what feels familiar: independence, self-containment, emotional distance. It's like stepping out of a room that felt too intense and finally getting fresh air. But here's the truth about that kind of relief. It's built on avoidance, not understanding. And anything built on avoidance has an expiration date. Because while the external pressure is gone, the internal reality hasn't actually changed. The emotions they struggled with didn't disappear. The connection they experienced didn't suddenly lose meaning. It's all still there, just quieter, less immediate, easier to ignore at first. But as time passes, something subtle begins to happen. The relief starts to lose its effect. What once felt like freedom begins to feel like absence. What once felt like space begins to feel like distance. And what once felt like calm begins to feel unclear. This is where confusion enters, because now they're left with a question they didn't have to face before. If I feel better without the pressure, why doesn't this feel as good as I expected? And that question doesn't always come with an easy answer. They may try to distract themselves through work, socializing, routines, even new connections. But distractions don't replace meaning. And when the noise dies down, the mind has a way of circling back to what hasn't been resolved. They might start thinking about specific moments. Conversations that linger longer than they expected. Things you said that didn't fully register at the time, but now feel significant. And here's where it gets even more complicated for them. They're not just feeling something, they're feeling something they don't fully understand. Because if they truly didn't care, there would be no confusion. If the connection meant nothing, there would be no second guessing. But confusion is a signal. It's the mind trying to reconcile two opposing experiences. The relief of distance and the lingering emotional imprint of what was lost. And for someone who isn't used to sitting with that kind of inner conflict, it can feel deeply uncomfortable. They may not label it as missing you. They may not even consciously admit that they're affected. But there's a shift happening beneath the surface, a restlessness, a sense that something doesn't quite add up, a quiet pull toward understanding something they once avoided. Because relief can only carry them so far. Eventually, the absence of emotional pressure is replaced by the presence of emotional ambiguity. And ambiguity is far harder to escape. It doesn't shout, it lingers. It shows up in unexpected moments. It asks questions without offering closure. It challenges the narrative they told themselves when they first felt that sense of freedom. And in that space, where relief fades and clarity hasn't yet formed, they begin to feel something they didn't anticipate when no contact began. Not just space, but uncertainty. For someone who leans toward dismissive avoidance, emotions are not something they process in real time. They're something they manage by pushing them down. It's not a conscious decision they sit and think about. It's a learned response. Over time, they've trained themselves to believe that if they don't engage with a feeling, it won't affect them as deeply. So instead of expressing XP, luring, or even naming what they feel, they suppress it. And suppression can look very convincing from the outside. It can look like they've moved on quickly, like they are unaffected, like the connection didn't leave a mark. But suppression is not the same as absence. It's more like putting something in a locked room and walking away, hoping that if you don't open the door, whatever is inside will somehow disappear. The problem is, it doesn't. It just sits there waiting, and over time the pressure inside that room begins to build. In the early stages, after no contact, they may genuinely believe they're fine. They might feel composed, even detached. They may fill their time with distractions, routines, or new experiences that keep their focus outward rather than inward. And for a while, that works, because when your attention is constantly occupied, it's easier to avoid what's unresolved. But emotions don't operate on a schedule that you can control. They don't ask for permission to resurface, and they don't disappear just because they were inconvenient. As time goes on, especially when the initial distractions lose their intensity, those suppressed feelings begin to find their way back. Not all at once, not in a dramatic wave, but in small, persistent moments that are harder to ignore. A memory that lingers longer than expected. A feeling of nostalgia that catches them off guard. A sudden awareness of your absence in situations where they once felt your presence, and because they didn't process these emotions when the relationship ended, or when distance began, they're now experiencing them in a delayed way. That delay is important, because what you might have felt immediately, the loss, the questions, the emotional impact, they postponed, and now while you may already be moving through your healing, they are just beginning to encounter what they once avoid. This is why it can sometimes seem like avoidant individuals feel things later. It's not that their feelings were never there. It's that those feelings were placed on hold, buried beneath layers of distraction and emotional defense. But here's the challenge for them. When those feelings return, they're often less prepared to deal with them. Because nothing has changed in how they process emotions. They still struggle with vulnerability. They still resist sitting with discomfort. They still default to distance when things feel too intense. So when these resurfacing emotions come back, sometimes stronger, sometimes more complex, they can feel overwhelming in a way that catches them off guard. They might not even immediately connect it to you. They may just feel unsettled, restless, slightly out of sync with themselves. And over time, as these moments accumulate, it becomes harder to ignore the source. Because suppressed emotions don't just resurface, they often intensify, not because the feeling itself has grown, but because it was never given space to be processed in a healthy way. It's like pressure building beneath the surface. The longer it's held down, the more force it carries when it finally comes up. And when it does, it can bring with it everything they avoided. The meaning of the connection, the role you played in their life, the things they didn't say, and the feelings they didn't allow themselves to fully experience. But even then, it doesn't always translate into action, because feeling something and knowing what to do with it are two very different things. They may sit with these emotions privately, without reaching out. They may think about you without expressing it. They may feel the weight of what they lost without having the tools to repair it. Because suppression doesn't just delay emotion, it also delays growth. And when those emotions finally return, they're not arriving in a space that's ready to hold them. They're arriving in the same internal environment that once pushed them away. When you step away and no contact truly begins, something shifts that goes far beyond just physical distance. You are no longer there to absorb, soften, or balance the emotional dynamic, and in that absence, something quietly powerful takes place. You become a mirror they can no longer avoid, because when you were present, there was always an external focus. The relationship itself, your reactions, your needs, your efforts, these gave them something to orient around. Even if they were distant at times, your presence still acted as a kind of emotional reference point. It allowed them to engage just enough without having to fully confront themselves. But when you're gone, that external focus disappears, and what's left is internal space. Now, for someone who is comfortable with introspection, that space can be used for growth. But for someone who has built a habit of avoiding emotional depth, that space can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, because there's nothing left to distract them from their own patterns. No one to blame, no one to deflect onto, no one to pull closer or push away, just themselves. And that's where the mirror effect begins. They may start to replay moments, not necessarily because they want to, but because there's nothing interrupting those thoughts anymore. Conversations that once felt insignificant may now carry a different weight. Things you expressed, your needs, your frustrations, your attempts to connect, may start to make more sense in hindsight. At the time, they might have dismissed those moments or avoided engaging with them fully. But distance has a way of changing perspective. Without the immediate pressure of interaction, they can observe the relationship more objectively. They can begin to see patterns, not just in you, but in themselves. How they pulled away when things got deeper. How they shut down during emotional conversations. How they avoided addressing issues until distance became the only solution. And this isn't always a comfortable realization, because it challenges the narrative they may have told themselves, that things just didn't work, that the connection wasn't right, or that they simply needed space. While those things might still feel true to them on some level, the absence of your presence forces them to sit with a more complete picture, one that includes their own role. That's what makes this mirror so powerful. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't argue, it doesn't demand. It simply reflects. And reflection, when it's unavoidable, creates awareness. Now, awareness doesn't always lead to immediate change. That's important to understand. Someone can recognize their patterns and still feel unsure about how to shift them. They may see what went wrong but lack the emotional tools to respond differently. But even that recognition is a step they couldn't take while they were still in the dynamic. Because when you were there, their focus could remain outward. They could stay in a reactive mode, responding to situations as they arose, without stepping back to see the larger pattern. Your absence removes that option. Now they are no longer reacting, they are remembering, reconsidering, reevaluating. And in those quiet moments where there's no conversation to hide behind, no distraction to pull them away, they begin to encounter a version of the relationship that is no longer filtered by avoidance. They may start to understand the emotional safety you provided. They may recognize the consistency you brought. They may even realize how their distance impacted you in ways they didn't fully acknowledge at the time. But here's the deeper layer. This mirror doesn't just reflect the relationship, it reflects their relationship with themselves, their discomfort with closeness, their fear of vulnerability, their tendency to withdraw instead of engage. And those realizations can be confronting in a way that silence alone never was. Because now, the distance isn't just between you and them. It's between who they are and who they could be if they chose to grow. And that's not something they can easily ignore once they've seen it. One of the most misunderstood aspects of a dismissive avoidance experience is what they actually miss when you're gone. It's easy to assume that if they do feel your absence, it's about you as a person in a direct, obvious way, your conversations, your presence, your connection. And while those things do matter, what often lingers even more deeply is something less visible, less defined, but incredibly powerful. The sense of safety you brought into their life. Not the kind of safety they would openly acknowledge, but the kind they quietly relied on. Because when you were there, you created a space where they didn't have to be perfect. A space where they could show up inconsistently, and you still met them with patience. A space where emotional depth was available, even if they didn't always step into it. You held a kind of steadiness that allowed them to engage with connection without fully understanding how much they depended on it. And that's the key. They often don't recognize safety while they're experiencing it. To them, it can feel like normalcy, or even, at times, like pressure, because being around someone emotionally available can highlight their own discomfort with vulnerability. So instead of labeling it as something valuable, they may interpret it as something overwhelming, something they need space from. But once that safety is gone, its absence becomes more noticeable than its presence ever was. Because now, they're back in their default environment one, where everything is self-contained, where emotional connection isn't readily accessible, and where they don't have that same grounding presence in their life. And at first, they might not consciously think, I miss the safety they gave me. It shows up more subtly than that. It shows up as a feeling that something is off, even when everything around them seems fine. It shows up in moments where they wish they could share something, but don't reach out. It shows up in the quiet realization that not everyone offered what you did, because what you gave wasn't just attention or affection, it was emotional consistency. A willingness to stay, to understand, to meet them where they were, even when they struggled to meet you in the same way. And that kind of presence leaves an imprint. Even if they didn't fully appreciate it at the time, even if they took it for granted, even if they resisted it, there's a part of them that felt it. And once it's no longer there, they begin to notice the difference. They may encounter new interactions that feel more surface level. They may notice how rare it is for someone to truly see them without demanding immediate vulnerability. They may even begin to compare quietly without fully admitting it to themselves. Because emotional safety isn't something you can easily replace. It's built over time through trust, patience, and presence. And when it's gone, there's no quick substitute for it. There's just the awareness that something meaningful is missing. But here's where it becomes complex for them. Recognizing that they miss the safety doesn't automatically mean they know how to return to it. Because that same safety also required them to face parts of themselves they weren't ready to confront. The fears, their defenses, their resistance to closeness. So even if they feel the absence, there can still be an internal conflict. Part of them is drawn to what you represented. Another part of them is still afraid of what it demands, and that tension can keep them in a state of quiet longing without action. They may think about the ease they felt with you, even if they couldn't fully relax into it at the time. They may remember how you responded with understanding instead of judgment. They may feel the contrast between what they had and what they now experience. But instead of clearly expressing, I miss you, it often translates into something less direct. An unspoken awareness that what you gave them wasn't ordinary. It was grounding, it was rare, and it was something they didn't fully value until they no longer had access to it. Distance has a way of doing what closeness sometimes cannot. It removes the noise, the reactions, the back and forth that often keeps two people locked in the same patterns. And in that space, something deeper begins to unfold, not just for them, but for you as well. Because growth doesn't happen in the middle of emotional chaos. It happens when there is enough stillness to actually see what's been going on beneath the surface. When no contact begins, it creates that stillness. At first, it may feel uncomfortable, even unnatural. You're used to the connection, the checking in, the subtle hope that something might shift if you just say the right thing or show up in the right way. But distance removes that constant engagement. It forces both of you out of the pre-Whitney rhythm and into something unfamiliar. And unfamiliar spaces are where growth begins. For them, this distance interrupts their ability to rely on avoidance in the same way. When you were present, they could regulate the connection by pulling back when things felt too intense and leaning in when it felt safe again. It was a cycle that allowed them to stay within their comfort zone without fully stepping outside of it. But now that cycle is broken. There's no immediate access to you, no way to test the waters, no option to re-engage only when it feels convenient. And that disruption creates a kind of emotional exposure they didn't have to face before. Not necessarily in an obvious, overwhelming way, but in a slow, underlying sense that something has changed, and they are no longer in control of how that change unfolds. That's where the potential for growth exists. Because when familiar coping mechanisms no longer work, a person is left with two choices: continue avoiding in new ways, or begin to confront what they've been running from. Now it's important to understand growth is not guaranteed. Distance creates the opportunity for it, but it doesn't force it. They may still choose distraction, denial, or new forms of emotional distance. They may repeat patterns in other areas of their life rather than address them directly. But even in that, something shifts. Because the experience of losing a connection that mattered, even if they didn't fully express it, leaves a mark. It introduces a reference point, a quiet awareness that something meaningful was there, and that their way of handling it may have contributed to its loss. And awareness, once it exists, doesn't completely disappear. It may sit in the background. It may not immediately change their behavior, but it becomes part of their internal landscape. For you, the growth is different, but just as powerful. Because distance pulls you out of a dynamic where you may have been overextending, over-explaining, or over-investing in someone who wasn't meeting you at the same level. It gives you the space to redirect your energy inward, to examine not just what they did, but what you allowed, what you tolerated, and what you truly need moving forward. It's an invitation to rebuild your sense of say-less without the constant influence of their inconsistency, to reconnect with your own emotional clarity, to strengthen your boundaries, to redefine what love, respect, and reciprocity actually look like for you. And as that happens, something begins to shift within you. You start to feel less dependent on their response for your sense of peace, less attached to the idea of what could have been, more grounded in what is and what you deserve. That's the transformation. Because while they may or may not grow in the way you hope, your growth is entirely within your control. And here's the deeper truth about distance. It doesn't just create separation, it creates perspective. It allows you to see the relationship without the emotional fog that once surrounded it, to recognize patterns that were hard to see when you were inside them, to understand the difference between connection and compatibility. And in that clarity, you begin to evolve. Not into someone who needs them to come back, but into someone who understands their own worth, regardless of whether they do. And that kind of growth doesn't just change how you see them, it changes how you see yourself. And every relationship that comes after. Thank you for taking the time to be here and invest in your growth. It truly matters. Goodbye for now, and may you continue choosing yourself with strength, clarity, and peace.